meeting, or definitely more than this out there?
No, they're the ones that are going to do everything they were talking about.
Yeah, that works for me. I don't know.
Well, you know what? I need a microphone that's really recording this.
Oh, yeah.
Did you turn the sound system on, Mike?
Yeah.
You're so good at this.
I can be able to do it better than I can. It was. I suppose I should. That's the one that's healthier. Yes, it is. Yeah, I agree. Anything with those people. True. I like great sonata. Just decided to probably not.
Is that hot? Is that
Yeah.
spicy? That's like,
Well, no, that's spicy.
oh, yeah.
No. I just like the egg, I think in Lincoln.
Well, I like their you know,
Yes.
Bless you.
We were going to go for a walk, but I think that's
Checking 1, 2, 3, 4. Checking 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, great. What's that? It's really quiet.
he's really quiet or we're really quiet? We can be out. Oh, see?
How's that? Okay. Perfect. And we're recording? Welcome, any of you who might be joining us virtually, to a review of our discipleship plan. I'm not sure how many people here or virtually are even aware that we have a discipleship plan. It's required by the conference, and we submitted one a few years ago. And we've talked a little bit about it here and there, but I'm not sure how many people could articulate what that means even. But when we're planning things, in order for us to function and to work well, we want everything to be moving in the same direction, right? If you were to try to pull a sled with dogs and you had them on 8 different leashes and they're running in 8 different directions, you're not going to make a whole lot of progress. You're going to get spun around, you're going to get pulled back and forth. You might end up moving somewhere, but it's going to be inefficient, and at times you may even be fighting against yourself. When you pull a sled with dogs, you have a single sort of leash that lines everybody up, and they all pull in the same direction. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're all doing exactly the same thing, but they're all working towards the same goal. They're all pulling in the same direction. And so that's kind of the idea with the discipleship plan, is as we're starting new ministries, as we're evaluating what we're doing and asking ourselves how effective things are, the discipleship plan is supposed to serve as that standard or that goal that we're headed towards, so we can say, okay, what are the things that we can create? What are the changes that we can make to what we're doing to help us be more effective? Well, if you can't answer the question more effective at what, then how could you possibly evaluate that? And the light is flickering. Is that causing problems for the, is that like a whole power thing, or is it just one of the lights? There's a delay online, but other than that, it's fine. Okay, so apparently it's just the light and not a larger problem. I tried to print out a contact sheet with the slides on it for me to have, so I could remember what the next slide was without turning around. I failed to do that. So, is that for these slides? Oh yeah, that would be fantastic. No, I'll just tell her when to switch slides. I won't. Thank you very much. Clearly, I should have just asked Chris instead of trying to be independent. All All right, I'm ready for the next slide whenever you are, I say as she runs back up to the computer. So the foundation of our discipleship plan is our mission, and many of you have heard me say before that every church has the same mission. It's the mission that Jesus gave all of us to do when he said, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. I'm not going to say a ton about that right now. One, because I know a lot of you have heard me talk about it before, and two, this is one of the resurrection appearances, and we're going to talk about it in church in like 2 weeks. So we'll save it for then, but this is the mission that Jesus gave us as his followers, as his church. Any church that has a mission other than this is doing something wrong. And I probably shouldn't say that when I'm being recorded for posterity, but I feel strongly enough about it to go on record as saying this is the mission of every church. Sometimes they word it in long-winded and even sometimes misleading ways, but this is, if your mission is not making disciples, then you might be a faith-based organization, but you're not a church. That's all I'm going to say about that. Let's move on to the next slide. That obviously begs the question, what does it mean to make disciples? A lot of times when people talk about disciple making, what they're really thinking about is spiritual disciplines or helping people who are already Christians to mature in their faith. There's a couple of problems with that. One, it's a very vague, that's so open that it's not helpful in terms of any kind of evaluation. The other problem with it is you're taking a very narrow segment of what is in reality a much larger process. And so I like to talk about holistic discipleship, which shouldn't be a necessary qualifier, right? All discipleship should be holistic, but because we often think of it in such narrow terms, I like to use the term holistic discipleship to remind us that it's part of a bigger whole. And really, holistic discipleship is this whole process of helping people to grow deeper in their faith, closer to their Creator, more mature in their spiritual life. And we've identified sort of 4 broad biblical categories along that path or along that spectrum, and are calling them disinterested, interested, committed, and invested. And those might not be completely self-explanatory, so we're going to take a look at what they mean. Oh, I should have said this before. As always, if you have questions, please ask them, right? The point of this little time right here is to make sure we're all on the same page with understanding our discipleship plan, because that's going to inform what we do in our next time. So if there's anything you don't understand, please, please, please ask. You're probably not the only one who doesn't get it. Even if you're not the only person in this room who doesn't get it, we're recording this, and plenty of other people will have the opportunity to watch it, and one of them may have the very same question that you have. So please don't hesitate to ask questions at any point in the process. I didn't really build in a lot of question time, but I really sincerely hope that if you have questions, you'll speak up and ask them. So let's look at kind of an overview of what each of these categories is. And again, we're talking about a process here, a spectrum that begins before people have anything to do with faith and ends with people as mature followers of disciples of Christ. So within each of these categories, there's going to be a bit of a spectrum, from the beginning of the category to the end of the category. So you can keep that in mind too as we go. It's not always going to be easy to draw a line, when does somebody stop being this first category and become part of the second category. But these are helpful for thinking about where people fall along the way, and it's helpful for thinking about how we can serve people where they're at along the way. So our first category is the disinterested. Can you guys read that, or is it too small? Most of you can read it. Okay, great. The biblical example of the disinterested are the people who don't show up in the stories, right? We read all these stories, Jesus goes here, and the people find out, and a crowd gathers because they all want to hear what Jesus has to say, and they want to see what kind of miracle he's going to do. He crosses the lake to get away, to get some peace and quiet, and people hear he's coming, and so a bunch of folks rush out from town to see him. The disinterested are the people who stayed in town. They're the people who went about their day, who went to work, who maybe were curious about the hullabaloo, maybe not. In either case, they weren't concerned enough, they weren't curious enough to put aside what they were doing and go check it out. The characteristics of people who fall into the disinterested category is that they have little or no interest in Jesus or the church. They may have interest in spiritual things, but they're not curious enough about at least this expression of spirituality to come and check out a church service or something along those lines. So how do we serve people? This is the very first step. This is before people are even thinking about maybe checking out church. And right now, honestly, this is probably the biggest category around us, right? If you look at the people who are living in the neighborhoods around us and the towns around us, probably the majority fall into this category. Some might claim some association with Christianity, but most of them haven't stepped foot in a church in years. And so we would probably put them in this, or ever in some cases, yeah. And I don't want to get too far off on a tangent, but in our Wesleyan theology, this is where grace begins, right? We have this idea of prevenient grace, the grace that God extends to us before we even know that we need grace. And that's where this grace begins. God is reaching out to these people who are disinterested and helping them to recognize a need for something more in their life. And most people who fall in this category experience that in some way or another. Most of them wouldn't say, God's making me feel like there's something missing, but most people in society feel like there's something missing in their life. And they pursue all these different things to try to fill that sense of something being missing. For some people, it's trying to earn so much money that they don't feel like something's missing anymore. If they just had enough money to buy that boat or that vacation house or whatever it is, then they would feel complete. Some people look to relationships, whether it's, if only my husband or wife would do what I need, I wouldn't feel this way. Or maybe it's looking outside of a marriage and saying, well, if I can just find the right person, or if I can find enough other people, then maybe I won't feel this way. But that sense of longing, God is already at work in their heart trying to help them recognize their need to be in communion with their Creator. And if God's already at work in their lives, we probably should be also, right? This is the starting point of discipleship. And in a lot of cases, it's the one that we have the most trouble with, right? How do we reach out to people who aren't interested? That's scary. How do we reach out to people who might be interested and we don't know it yet, or they don't know it yet? How do we invite people? How do we serve people in this category? And so that's actually the last thing up there. How do we serve people in this category? First off, actually serve them, right? They might not know that they have a need for God or a need for fellowship that they could find in church, but they do know that they have needs. And if we can find ways to meet some of those needs, then we're making a connection, and that we're helping them to recognize that maybe the church is a place that can meet other needs as well. Building relationships. Relationships are the number one context for inviting people to take steps of faith, whether that's inviting somebody to a church service on a Sunday morning, or inviting them to one of the outreach events that we do, like the pancakes or the pumpkin festival. Building relationships with people is important in so many ways, but one of them is it gives us kind of that relational capital to be able to share parts of our lives and say, one of the things that's really helpful for me is this community that I have in my church, things like that. So we can serve them by actually serving and helping to meet needs. We can serve them by building relationships where they can experience some love and some grace like they should expect from a church and from God, and where they can get a sense that the church may be able to meet more of their needs. And then lastly, we can pray for them. And we should be praying for them. We should be praying for everybody, but especially the people in our lives who haven't begun any kind of religious journey, or who are disinterested in spiritual things, or disinterested in church or in Jesus. We can and should be praying for them, ideally by name, at least once in a while. Because if we believe that our faith is important, then we should want other people to experience that as well. We should desire that they find the same meaning and fulfillment that we have, and so we can pray for them. Some people would add more aggressive tactics to this list, And I don't know that there's necessarily anything intrinsically wrong with them. I don't think they're the most useful ways to approach things. You have people out there passing out tracts and things like that, and I'm not sure how effective that really is. I don't want to disparage people who are doing that, but I didn't include it on our list here because I think these are more effective ways for serving people in this category. Any questions about the disinterested?
Yeah, when you say disinterested, we're talking about folks who have no affiliation with anything, right? We're not talking,
Typically, yeah.
But so we're not including folks who are committed and definitely involved with other things.
So that's a bit of a hornet's nest that I'd prefer not to kick if possible. I know. We've talked a little bit in our sermon series about Jesus' life, about some of the bold claims that he makes. And if we take those claims seriously, then we have to take seriously the possibility that this is the best option. And so I'm not saying that we should be trying to steal folks out of other churches or anything, but if we believe that this is the best option for our souls, for all souls, then people who are, and I'm not saying other churches like other Christian churches, people who are parts of other faiths, if we believe Christianity is the ideal solution or the ideal option, then I think it's appropriate for us to prayerfully hope that people who are part of other faiths might at least consider faith in Jesus. I know that's a sticky issue for people who are in interfaith marriages, but right, yes.
I mean, it is a definite thing as our society becomes far more
Right.
diverse and pluralistic. I mean,
Yeah.
there is the line between talking to folks and but also respecting their
Right.
choices.
For those who are online and maybe can't hear this, the question is kind of where is the line where we want to be respectful of other people's faiths? Part of the reason why I chose these specific means of serving people in this category is I think that we can safely do that with anybody without causing problems or conflict, right? We can serve people, we can build relationships with people, we can pray for people regardless of what faith they belong to and not cause conflict or strife. So I think those are good starting places. Any other questions, comments, thoughts on the district? Yeah.
I think different polls have sort of shown that many people today aren't interested in a particular organized faith, but they're out there, as you said before, looking for something.
Yeah.
Or not looking until something happens.
Right. A lot of people have spiritual interest these days, but aren't necessarily looking at churches or aren't looking for any kind of organized religion unless something happens in their life, some kind of tragedy or some kind of change, and they have a feeling that they need some sort of stability. And that's one of the strengths to things like trying to meet people's needs and building relationships, is that if they are growing in their curiosity about spiritual things, it may provide an opportunity for you to invite them and say, hey, I really enjoy my church. Why don't you come check it out and see if it's something appealing to you? Or if they find themselves in a crisis or a time of change and they need help, they need stability, they already have that connection with you and with the church. Maybe we've met a need for them before. Maybe they have some relationships here. And when they find themselves in a moment of need, that might be an opportunity to invite them to be more connected with things. Anything else? Yes. Yeah, none of these are instantaneous. This is, there will be a process through each one of these categories. And I haven't really mentioned it yet. I was going to mention it later, but part of a disciple-making plan is that we have to think about creating or looking for at least opportunities to invite people to grow. How do we look for those opportunities? How do we create those opportunities to help people who are currently disinterested to maybe move into that interested category? And that's actually kind of an example of what Bob was just saying, somebody who's been in the disinterested category, if they have a relationship with somebody in the church, or if the church has met a need before, those moments of change, those moments of uncertainty, those moments of loss can sometimes be very effective opportunities to say, hey, my faith has really helped me when I have experienced turmoil. Maybe you'd like to come and check out a couple of our services and see if there isn't something there that's helpful for you also. So yeah, within these categories, the disinterested, we're not really focused on growing people's maturity at all yet, but growing, taking time to invest in relationships, to meet needs, and prayerfully watching for opportunities where there might be an open door to invite them to possibly be interested in things. And then the further in you get, the more we'll look at throughout that time span, kind of growing within that category before kind of, I guess, graduating to the next. And again, these you're not, even with that, you're not, a lot of times you won't see kind of sharp divisions. People will go from being interested to being more interested to being more involved to suddenly being committed, and you might not really even notice until you're looking backwards on it. Hold on one second. I probably should have brought water in here. Let's go to the interested side. No, don't, it's fine. Are we going to go to the interested side? Excellent. So the biblical, oh, thank you. Do you need it? Not yet. Okay, we'll share. We can share. Yeah. We're already on slide 5, so we're making good time. The biblical example for the interested are the people who do show up. They're the crowds. This is the people who run out from the city to see Jesus. They're curious to hear what he's going to teach. In many ways, they're curious to watch a miracle. They want to see, is Jesus going to do something miraculous like he did, in that other town the other day. They have enough interest to go and see what's going on. So the characteristics of this group are that they're curious about what Jesus said and did and what he can or will do for them. And that's kind of an important distinction here, right? The interested are usually more focused on what can or will or is being done for them than they are about what's being done for others or what Jesus wanted, right? They're more interested in having their needs met than they are in what Jesus is actually telling them they should be doing. But they're curious about what Jesus said and did and what he can or will do for them biblically, but also now, right? This is people who are curious about who Jesus was, about what Jesus did, and oftentimes curious about what he can or will do for them. They attend church sometimes, and again, this is a category. This includes people who show up on Christmas and or Easter and not any of the other 50 weeks out of the year. This includes people who are here, half of the time, and half of the time aren't because they have other conflicts and it's just not a priority. They give some, maybe, and again, a spectrum. Maybe they toss in a few bucks here and there when it feels convenient. Maybe they're giving regularly, but it's not, as much as maybe they should be. They may listen to things like, they may do things like listen to Christian radio. They might pray, but it's probably mostly when they need something, instead of praying regularly, it's usually like, oh gosh, my car won't start. Jesus, please help me. Or you hear somebody's sick and they pray for the person who's sick, but it's maybe not a regular practice. They might even read the Bible occasionally, but it's probably not something that they're really in the habit of doing normally or regularly. How to serve. Deepen relationships, right? If people are coming, at least some of the time, they probably have some relationships with folks within the church already. They are at least acquainted with the people that they sit near the couple of times that they're here. They may know they may be here a couple times a year because they know some of the folks outside of church. So we can serve them by deepening those relationships. which will provide more context for faith, which will provide more opportunity for us to demonstrate God's love and grace, which will provide more comfortability. So if they do find themselves in a difficult time, they feel more comfortable coming and talking to somebody from the church about it. Inviting to small groups, Bible studies, things like that. These are people who have some interest, right? They wouldn't be here even a couple of times a year if they didn't have at least a little bit of interest. If we have relationships and are growing in relationships with them, we have an opportunity to say, hey, Bonnie's about to start another Bible study. I loved the last one. You should come and check it out. And maybe they're not, maybe they're still working and they can't do an afternoon Bible study. Maybe they're not ready for that yet. But if we have those if we're building meaningful relationships and we know that they have some interest, there's no harm, there's no danger really in saying, hey, why don't you come check out this other thing that we're doing? And we can serve them by encouraging things like the practice of spiritual disciplines and greater participation in the church. They've been here. They know that we think prayer is a good thing. They know that we think reading the Bible is a good thing. They know that we would like people to participate in more stuff. If they're here and they're interested, we should be looking for or creating opportunities to invite people to participate in new ways, in different ways. We should be encouraging people. And some of this we absolutely are doing already. In fact, we had a whole sermon series, I think, was that last summer that we did the sermon series on spiritual disciplines? Or last Lent, maybe? Yeah, sometime last year. We did a whole sermon series. It was during Lent, yeah. Our whole Lenten sermon series was encouraging people to try out some of these spiritual disciplines with the hopes that they would become regular practices for some people. So we are absolutely doing some of these things already, but we're highlighting it now so that when we go out for our brainstorming session, we're remembering, okay, if we want to serve people who are interested, things like creating opportunities for them to practice spiritual disciplines and get in the habit of them are one of the ways that we can do that. Offering things like Bible studies and meaningful small groups that we can invite them to are one of the ways that we can do that. Any questions, comments, thoughts on the interested? No? Well, that was easier than the disinterested for sure. Okay. All right, let's move on to the committed then. The biblical example for the committed are the people who are following Jesus and the ones who are taking his teaching to heart. And this doesn't just mean the 12 apostles, right? There were whole crowds that were following Jesus, who were hungry not just for the bread that he occasionally multiplied or the fish. They were hungry for what he had to say. They were willing to reorganize their lives in order to follow him around. And in some cases, they put businesses and relationships on hold and were following him for months or even years at a time. Some of them were investing their own personal finances in making sure Jesus and the disciples were fed and things like that. So the committed are people who are starting to change some priorities, willing to make changes to their lives. The characteristics that we look for here are they're serious enough about following Jesus that their lives are changed, right? They're starting to rearrange priorities. They're starting to think about others rather than themselves, things like that. Some of the characteristics we can look for, some of the characteristics that we can look for today. I mean, that's first one certainly still, but church is generally a priority, right? It's not that they're coming when it's convenient. It's not that they're going to disappear if there's anything else going on. They're prioritizing church. And yes, everybody's going to miss church once in a while. People get sick. You're out of town. But people who are in this committed category are making church a priority, and they're here as often as they can be. And typically, they're participating beyond just Sunday morning, whether that's serving on a committee or being in the choir or coming in on other days to make food for different things, stuff like that. They're tithing typically. Now again, spectrum, but if you're in the committed category and you're not tithing, you should be actively working towards it. And regularly practicing spiritual disciplines. Spectrum, right? Maybe you're not as regular as you would like to be, but if you're in the committed category, there should be sort of regular prayer. There should be regular reading of scripture, and maybe even things like fasting occasionally, and being intentional about Sabbath rest and some of those other things. Spiritual disciplines should be kind of a habit. How do we serve people who are in the committed category? People who fall into this category are really starting to make a transition where we still do want to be serving them for sure, but they're really starting to turn around more and more and think not about how they can be served, but about how they can serve. That's part of that change. That's part of the shifting priorities, moving away from how can Jesus serve me, how can the church serve me, to how can I serve other people. And so one of the main ways that we can serve people who are falling into the committed category is by providing resources for their own personal growth, whether that's small groups, whether that's accountability, whether that's studies that are specifically going through spiritual disciplines and talking about how to make those a regular part of your lives. Just giving them the resources that they need to really take responsibility for their own personal spiritual health and to be able to grow in that way. And equipping and empowering them to use their spiritual gifts in ministries that will serve others and be fulfilling. As people start to think more about how can I serve others, we want to make sure that we're creating opportunities for them to do that. We want to make sure we're helping people identify where their gifting is and help them to think through what kind of ministry they would find fulfilling. Who do I most want to see impacted? Do I want to see children impacted? Do I want to see the lives of people who are in that senior category being impacted? Do I have a real heart for young families? If we're really going to serve people who are starting to build their priorities around what Jesus is calling us to, and people who are growing in their desire to serve and be a blessing, we need to create opportunities for them to use their gifts in a way that's going to be meaningful for them. And that sometimes runs a little bit contrary to the way our churches are set up by discipline. One of the reasons why oftentimes we have people burnt out in our churches is because we have a list of positions that we're supposed to keep full. We have to have X number of trustees, we have to have an SPR, and we have to have a finance committee, we have to have this and that, and there's all these different positions within those committees that we need filled. And so what oftentimes happens is as people get into this committed category, we say, oh, you're ready to serve, we need somebody to be our chair of finance, so why don't you come and do that? And but I hire an accountant because I can't do my own finances at home. Oh, you'll be fine. And we suck them in, and we put them in these positions that they're not necessarily qualified for. Let me go on record now as saying that this is not what happened to Jeff. Jeff was qualified for his position, and he did an admirable job. But we have this tendency to just grab anybody who's reaching this committed point and jam them into a committee that we need to fill a spot on, and then they end up stuck there for a decade, and by the time they finally get out of that committee, they don't want to sign up for anything anymore because they didn't enjoy that ministry, it didn't use their gifts, it wasn't aligned with the things that they were passionate about, and then we wonder why we have a lack of people wanting to volunteer for things. If we want to take seriously serving people within each category along this spectrum, we need to consider how we're treating people once they reach this committed level, once they're starting to volunteer for things, and instead of jamming every different shaped peg that we're offered into whichever round hole happens to be open at the time, we need to start thinking about creating some holes that are appropriately shaped for the people who are ready to fill them. Yeah.
So I think you answered this, but people that may do ministries other places, I think Corry did. I don't remember Corry being on any committees. He may have been, and I just didn't know it. But going to different countries and doing scrap metal and stuff here so that you could go there.
Yeah.
That's the type of, some of the types of folks you're talking about. Like I'm wrestling with folks that are committed in that way, that the ministry may not be in certain anymore.
Right. So the question is, what about people who are engaged in ministry that's maybe outside of official ministries of the church? And if you happen to be on my DCOM or Boom, please plug your ears for a moment. Our mission that Jesus gave us is to make disciples of Jesus Christ and people who are expanding the kingdom of God. And this church and this congregation is one small part of that work. And if we're going to take our mission seriously, we need to be working on getting people growing through this spectrum of faith. And if somebody is finding an opportunity to use their gifts and grow and serve others and have an impact outside of what we're doing as a congregation, we should absolutely be encouraging and supporting that. Ideally, if they're part of our congregation, we should be creating opportunities for them to do that within the framework of our larger ministry, and then they won't have to be outside sort of the scope of our ministry. But if somebody is, if somebody's called to be doing ministry in Nicaragua, and we're not in a position to help them do that, we should absolutely do whatever we can to help them to do that ministry that's going to be meaningful and promote their growth. You can unplug your ears now. Any other questions, comments, thoughts on this committed category? Most of these categories will still benefit from the things beneath that. Right? Beneath is a terrible term to use because it can have a negative connotation. Just because you've matured sort of into a new category doesn't mean you're not going to still benefit from some of the things that we talked about before, right? Just because people are becoming committed doesn't lessen the need for building relationships and deepening relationships. In fact, sometimes it makes it even more important, because as people start to take responsibility for their own faith and start to take responsibility for, engaging in new ministries, oftentimes they may find that they need some support and they need those relationships where they can go to somebody and say, gosh, I'm just not sure what I'm supposed to do here. Or maybe they're going to invest a lot of time and energy into a ministry idea and it doesn't pan out the way they want it to. That's absolutely going to happen sometimes. No matter how faithful we are in praying about what we're doing, no matter how strongly we feel about an idea, there's going to be times where we do something and we don't get the turnout we want. It doesn't go the way we want it to. And it's natural to feel some disappointment about that. And people if they don't have relationships where they can come and share that disappointment or that frustration, it's going to fester, and then they're not going to want to try new things. For many people, there's already a very strong aversion to risk. And if they risk something and it doesn't work out the way they want it to, if they can't talk through that and process it and get the encouragement and the support that they need, they're never going to take a risk again, at least not a similar one. So it's definitely important that we keep investing in relationships as people are maturing and keep looking for ways to serve. Just because somebody's reaching a point where they're more interested in serving others than in being served doesn't mean they don't still need to be served. There are people who, if I can hold myself up as an example, I suppose, I'm always hesitant to do that. I probably shouldn't be. Paul was very quick to do it. He's probably a better example than I am, so I guess it was easier for him. But at any rate, yes, yes, not Paul, the disciple Paul. But I have reached a point where I am more interested in serving others than being served. And yet, when I had my surgery, and so many folks from the church served me and my family by providing food and offering rides and all of those things, that was incredibly meaningful and incredibly helpful. So just because people are maturing into new categories, they can still benefit from things that we've identified in earlier categories, but we also need to find new ways to support that new maturity and to give them the tools and the resources and the knowledge that they need to be able to serve in new ways and to engage in ministry in new ways. Any other thoughts, comments, questions on the committed? No? All right. On to the next slide. Number 7. There's only 11, so we really are making good time. Yeah. The invested. This is our sort of our final category. Discipleship is a lifelong thing. It never really ends. But reaching this point of being invested is kind of the last category that we can identify. And at that point, you're just kind of maturing within it. The biblical example here would be like the 12 apostles, the 70 that Jesus, we talked in our series about Jesus sending out the 12. Later on, he actually sends out a group of 70, which I believe includes the original 12, but also another 58 people. And they all go out to teach the things that he had taught them. This would include people like the Apostle Paul and Timothy and Titus, whom he taught. These are people who have really taken on the mantle of Jesus' ministry, people who have accepted his message not only to the point where it's reshaping their lives, but to the point where they are taking responsibility for continuing his work and for carrying out the mission that he gave for us to carry out. The characteristics that we see in this group, Jesus' message and mission are among their highest priorities. So not only are they making things like coming to church a priority, they're shaping the priorities of their lives around Jesus' message and mission. It's affecting their finances, it's affecting how they're spending their time and energy. It's working its way into sort of it's affecting the way they treat people throughout their day. And that should be true. That should be starting to be true in earlier categories as well. But when you reach this invested point, you're really finding your identity in Christ and doing your best in all ways to continue his ministry and to show love and grace to others. Some of the other characteristics that we can look for in this category are seriously pursuing personal spiritual growth and the growth of God's kingdom. So not just reaching the point where they're starting to serve, but really taking seriously not only their own spiritual growth, but the spiritual growth of others. Really taking on some leadership in things like fostering discipleship in other people and helping to shape the church and investing in the lives of friends, family, people around them. They're devoted to worshiping God and loving and serving others. They don't just show up on Sunday morning because they want to see some friends in the pews, or they don't show up for the food afterwards. They're here because they're excited to be where God is. They're excited for the opportunity to worship and to pray and to hear the word and to have some real fellowship. And they're devoted to serving others. It's not something that they do when it's convenient. It's not something that they just do when they hear there's a big need. They're looking for opportunities to serve people every day. And maybe for some, even reaching a point where they don't even realize that they're looking anymore. Like, I've met a few folks who it was their instinct, man. Like, if there was a need, they were working on it before you even knew it was a need. But those are some of the categories that we look for. And again, you're not leaving behind anything from earlier categories. So by the time you've really taken on that mantle and you're really making Jesus' mission your own, you're still tithing, you're still practicing spiritual disciplines regularly, you're still investing in building relationships and those sorts of things that we talked about in some of the earlier categories. How do we serve these folks? This is really tricky, right? Because these are people who are really mature believers and whose priority is serving others. But there are still some things that we can do to help them in their growth. One of them is mentoring. If somebody's been in this category for a little while and they see somebody else really growing into it, there's an opportunity there for them to say, hey, maybe we can grab coffee once a week or once a month or whatever, and just talk about, what's going on in our lives, talk about this new ministry that you're a part of. And it's an opportunity to pass along some of the lessons that they've learned in ministry over the years, an opportunity to invest in the growth of somebody who's really at what I think is a very exciting part of their spiritual journey, and to help them take those steps to really mature and become the leader that they're on the verge of being. Another way is accountability, right? We live in a society that in many ways shies away from accountability, but it's at the heart of Methodism. Like that was the pre-Methodist movement back when it was John and Charles Wesley and a handful of their friends. The very heart of what they were doing was getting together regularly to hold each other accountable, to ask each other, what are you doing to grow in your faith? What are you doing to serve others? How are you living out the love of Jesus in your lives? And those aren't the exact questions that they used, but they would get together regularly to go over and ask each other some hard questions. How did you sin this week? What are you doing about it? How are you going to sin less next week? And people who are at this point where they're really becoming or living as mature disciples still need that accountability. They need people to help them continue to do what they're doing and continue to find opportunities to grow. It gets harder to grow in a lot of ways once you reach this point because you already know a ton of stuff and you're already shifting your priorities. And how do you keep growing? It's kind of like going to if you're somebody who goes to the gym a lot, which clearly I am not, but at one point in my life I was. And once you reach like a certain level of strength, it's hard to get stronger. And if you don't have people who are going to keep you accountable, like you have to do a lot of work just to maintain that strength. And so those deep relationships, those mentors, those opportunities to have some accountability and have people ask, are you keeping a Sabbath? Are you keeping up with your reading? Are you keeping up with your prayer times? What have you done this week to serve other people? That accountability can be really valuable. And again, this is kind of repeating something that we said for the committed group, but especially for the invested, it's really important that we're creating opportunities for meaningful ministry. People who reach this point aren't just exploring new ministry generally. Sometimes they may be, but usually that's more like, that committed category where you're kind of discovering your spiritual gifts and looking for opportunities to use them. When people have really taken on Jesus' mission and are serious about it, more often than not, they'll have some sense of who they're called to work with and what they want to do. And it's vital that we create opportunities for them to do that work. Any questions about that?
Is it possible for people who are at not lower, but what I mean? Like,
Earlier?
Yeah, an earlier one, to truly understand the needs of folks who are really desperate?
Sometimes, yes, it's difficult. Repeat the question. Is it possible for people in sort of these earlier, kind of less mature categories to really understand the needs and how to serve people in the more mature categories? And the answer is that the typical flow is going to be from more mature to less mature, right? People who are committed to the faith are primarily going to be serving and ministering to people who are interested or disinterested. People who are only interested may want to serve. They're mostly going to be serving sort of other interested people or the disinterested. But there are definitely times where it can go the other direction. Something like, with my surgery, you don't have to be committed or invested to recognize there's a need for service there. Even something like, Romeo's, there's opportunities to grow relationships at those breakfast times, and you don't have to be real mature to understand that we can, kind of invest in each other's lives and make ourselves available when needs arise and stuff like that. So the typical flow here is from more mature to less mature, but there are opportunities for people to kind of serve in the other direction sometimes. And sometimes maybe even without noticing, just because somebody is spiritually mature doesn't mean they're not going to come in here some Sundays disappointed about something or feeling down or lonely or whatever. And somebody might be completely unaware, but just come up with a friendly smile and a handshake or a hug, and that could be exactly what they need at that moment. And that kind of less mature person is just serving in a way that they know how to serve, and might know, might not know what a blessing they've been to kind of a more mature person. So it does move both ways sometimes, but the typical flow is kind of the more mature serving the less mature. Are you asking, I'm not 100% sure if I know what you're asking. Are you asking if it's possible to kind of go up and down? Or are you asking, I'm not 100% sure what you're asking.
Can a person in their discipline plan, they have achieved in different parts of their spiritual life, be a vertical type of thing?
Can people fall sort of into different categories within different parts of their spiritual life? So again, these are each a spectrum. I don't want to try to think of it too narrowly or too specifically. Like if you wanted to try to break it down and say, well, like in terms of my prayer time, I'm in this category, but my giving is this category, and my attendance is this category. I suppose you could do that. I'm not sure that's a useful tool. Like the idea here is to provide a framework for us to think about how we can serve people at different points in their faith.
Your explanation of
Yeah.
this, and it just occurred to me.
Yeah.
Is it possible to think of it in a vertical rather than?
You can think of it, I mean, to me, it doesn't make any difference if you're thinking vertically or horizontally, but I have good spatial awareness, so they're both the same to me. The answer is each of these is a spectrum. So when you think about a category, and again, and sometimes it's hard to differentiate, you know, do I personally fall into interested or committed? Well, in some ways it seems like the interested fits more, in some ways it seems like committed fits more. That probably means you're somewhere in that hazy area between the two. And that probably means that you can be served sort of in different ways depending on which part of your life it's addressing. You know, somebody who, in terms of, you know, maybe just to use some examples of things that we specifically already talked about, right? People who are committed tend to make church a priority and are engaged with things outside of Sunday morning. People who are, but they also tend to be pretty steady on their spiritual disciplines. So maybe we have folks in our church who are committed to Sunday morning and doing things outside of Sunday morning, but aren't necessarily regularly practicing spiritual disciplines. Well, which category do they fall into? Both. There's somewhere, right, I'm not saying that's you specifically, I just wanted to use examples from things we had already talked about. Which category does that person fall into? They're somewhere in the middle, they're somewhere between these, and when it comes to things like helping them find meaningful ministries and understand their spiritual gifts so they can use them in a meaningful way, they'll be better served by things that are kind of in that committed category where we're maybe looking for an opportunity to do a spiritual gifts workshop or something. When it comes to their spiritual disciplines, they'd be better served by something that maybe we've envisioned targeting the interested more, where it's that Lenten sermon series that we did on spiritual disciplines and implementing them. So people may be served best by ministries with kind of different target based on which part of their life it is. But when we talk about what category somebody falls into, we're just using it as a broad framework to help us think through trying to make sure we're offering things that are going to serve people along this whole path, right? The idea here isn't to fixate on the 4 categories. It's for us to make sure we're not just fixating on one part of this journey, because we started off by saying a lot of times when we talk about discipleship, we just think about this spiritual maturity component where we're talking about people who are already here at the church and helping them grow in their spirituality. That's how some people envision discipleship, but that's a very narrow part of what is really a lifelong process of growth in our faith. So this framework is supposed to help us be thinking through that whole spectrum and helping us to try to hit markers all along that road instead of getting tied up on one specific element or making it so general that we're not achieving anything at all. So like anything like this, if we fixate too much on the minutia, it may start to break down a little bit, but as a broad framework, I think it can be very helpful for us. Any other thoughts, questions, concerned on the invested or the categories in general? Okay, let's move on to our next slide then. Our vision, learning continually, living in community, and loving like Christ. Hopefully that phrase sounds very familiar. It's in every email that we send out. It's on every bulletin that we print. It's in the slideshow every week. I won't talk about it a ton because I've done a sermon on it before and we've talked about it in various different meetings and things. But just as a very brief recap, these are 3 areas of ministry focus that we identified and see as both strengths and opportunities for us to engage in helping people move through these categories. Learning continually is fairly self-explanatory. Living in community is really about that relationship building that we've talked about. This involves just building, meeting people and planting some seeds and making people feel welcome in our building, whether they're here for preschool or for a Sunday morning event or for pumpkins or pancakes or whatever it is. And it goes up to building those deepening relationships in small groups. It goes up to trying to do some accountability in different contexts. But that idea of living together, investing in each other's lives, supporting one another, creating a context in which we experience love and grace and forgiveness, and then loving like Christ, which is really about serving, right? Jesus' love was sacrificial. Jesus' love went out and met needs. And so loving like Christ is about us meeting needs in the community. It's about us offering things to people as signs of love. When we give away free food at different outreach events, we're not just trying to bribe people in the doors, we're hoping to show them some love through that gift. When we find opportunities to serve people, even when we support, when we send or fund 3,000 rolls of toilet paper for the food pantry, that one's a little bit more obscure because the people receiving it don't necessarily know that it was done as an act of love, but we are absolutely showing love or loving people, whether they know it or not, through that kind of service. So that's the 3 areas of ministry focus that we've identified as sort of our priorities. Our mission is what we're called to, right? We're called to make disciples. Our vision is how we see ourselves carrying out that mission. So we know what Jesus has called us to do. He's called us to make disciples. How are we going to carry out that work? What opportunities do we have here and now to further the mission? What strengths and or resources do we have to further that mission? Those are the questions that we started with that led us to this particular vision. And most of you probably remember we had the cottage meetings and we had a lot of discussion around what the church has done in the past, what we see as some of our strengths, both in the past and now, what we see as opportunities to bring back things, to start new things, to use some of the gifts and talents that are present in the congregation. And those questions are what led us to this vision of making disciples by learning continually, living in community, and loving like Christ. You go to the next slide, please. Number 9. How do we implement this vision? It's all well and good to have a vision. It's important, actually, that we have some vision for how we're going to carry out this ministry that we've been called to. Having a vision statement doesn't actually change anything, right? At this point, every church under the moon has a vision statement, and in most of them, the majority of the people cannot tell you what it is. Honestly, if 50% of our congregation can say our vision statement without looking at it, I would be pleasantly surprised. And it's basically 6 words long and printed on everything we do. In order for this to be effective, we have to actually use it. And the 2 primary ways that we do that are by reorienting our current ministries and by creating new ministries. So we have things that we do because we've always done them. We have things that we do because we wanted to bring them back after COVID because we missed them. We have things that we do because they're required by discipline that we do them. In order for that effort, for that time and energy to be pulling in the same direction as the rest of our sled dogs, we have to be conscientious about orienting. We have to make sure it's aligned with this vision that we have. And for some things, that's very easy and very obvious, right? The food and fellowship that we're doing, I think fairly clearly, hoping to foster that sense of community. We're hoping to build some relationships by encouraging people to stick around and fellowship some more and have a longer conversation than they might have if they're just eating a cookie and drinking a cup of coffee and heading out the door. You're sitting down, you're eating a meal, you're hopefully sharing more about your lives, maybe, just maybe, even talking a little bit about the sermon that you just heard. We started that with the hope, with the intention that that would be something that's helping to build community so that we can live in community. Some of them, how we align with this vision might be a little bit less obvious. How does an SPR meeting, which we are required by discipline to have, align with this vision? How does a trustees meeting, which we are required by discipline to have, align with this vision? And the short answer is, if we're not intentional about it, it doesn't. And that doesn't change the fact that we have to do it, but we have the opportunity, if we're thinking with some intention about our discipleship plan, to incorporate aspects that will at least partially align that time, that investment of energy and resources with this vision. And that may be including a learning time within it. Maybe we're going to have maybe somebody's going to prepare 5 or 10 minutes about how something we're doing with the building can further our mission. Maybe it's as simple as including a time at the beginning where we're going to do something to build relationships. Those of you who are part of our 10 Steps small group the first year that I was here will remember that pretty much every time we met, we did something called high-low, where we'd go around the circle and everybody would share one high point and one low point from the previous week. And that just, it encourages a little bit of vulnerability. I don't want to say forces, but it very strongly encourages us to open up a little bit and share about what's going on in our lives, both the things that are bringing us joy and also some of the ways that we're struggling. And that helps to foster community. It gives us an opportunity even to pray for each other. Sometimes your low light is that, the weather was crummy and you just had a down week. Sometimes your low light is, a close friend, a close family member has gotten sick, and we have an opportunity to pray with you and support you. We never had it happen in the group specifically, but when you're taking that time and being intentional about opening up, somebody may have just had a death in the family. Somebody may have just gotten a terrible diagnosis. And if you're taking that opportunity to build a little bit of community there, it may even create opportunities to serve one another and to show some love. So we can reorient the programming that we're already doing to help it align with this vision so that everything we're doing is pulling in the same direction, and also creating new ministries. As we move into our second portion in a little bit here, we'll be brainstorming some ideas for new things that we can try, old things that maybe we can bring back. And while we're doing that, this vision for how we're going to carry out our mission should be at the center of that. In fact, I know it'll be at the center of that because we're going to make it the center of that. And ideally, I think it says this at the bottom of the slide, ideally, Our goal here, as we're brainstorming and as we're creating new ministry, as we're reorienting the ministries that we already have, our goal should be that we should be offering things in each of these 3 ministry focus areas at all 4 of these broad categories of the stages of discipleship, which will look familiar when Angie switches to slide number 10, because probably all of you have seen this by now, and even if you hadn't seen it before today, it's already drawn on the whiteboard in Homer Hall. This is a convenient tool for us to use for brainstorming and planning because it's a visual representation of exactly what I just said. This is all 4 phases of discipleship shown vertically. And it shown with all 3 of these areas of ministry focus. And it gives us an opportunity to think through how are we using these strengths and opportunities that we've identified, learning continually, living in community, and loving like Christ. How are we operating in each of those 3 ways to meet the needs of people in these different categories? And again, just as a warning before we start brainstorming, the further down towards maturity we get, the harder it's going to be in some of these cases. It's going to be hard for us to generate content aimed at teaching the invested. It's going to be tougher to come up with those ideas. Teaching the disinterested is easy because we can literally offer any teaching opportunity. Last summer, we did a couple of Fix It 101 classes where Jeff came in and taught people about different hammers and saws and how to put together a stud wall, and I don't remember what else, so different types of saws for different projects. And it was just kind of a good time to invite some people who wouldn't normally come to church into our building and to serve them by teaching and to start planting some seeds, to build a few relationships. I don't know that any of them have ever come back for a service or anything, but if they find themselves in a position where they want a church funeral, if they find themselves in a position where maybe they need some help or some advice, maybe they'll reach out. And even if they don't, we have served them and planted some seeds. So the farther down the list we go, the more difficult it'll be. I guess I should pause real quick before, I'm starting to wrap things up, but I want to give one more chance. Are there any questions about these areas of ministry focus, about anything that we've talked about at all? No? Okay. Are there any questions about anything we haven't talked about yet? All right, great. So probably we'll take like a 5 or 10 minute break, let everybody stretch their legs, shut down the projectors and stuff, and then we'll meet in Homer Hall for our next session, which will be brainstorming. Feel free to grab yourself a cup of coffee or some fruit or pastries. If you're watching this online, I'm sorry, you'll have to provide your own refreshments. But I hope that you found this interesting and you didn't get a chance to ask questions. But if you have any, go ahead and send them to me or to the church, and Chris will forward them to me, and I'll do my best to answer those for you. So take 10, and we'll meet up at 10:30 in Homer Hall.